Hi friends, welcome or welcome back if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the chapter Conundrum. And today I've got an exciting video for you guys. We're going to talk about all of my favorite sci-fi and fantasy books. So hopefully you have your Goodreads or Storygraph open on another tab ready to mark things as want to read if you haven't yet. Maybe you want to grab a drink and snack and make sure you're really comfy. Just so you guys know, I'm not ranking these or putting them in any specific order. If they're in this video, they're a favorite. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So the first favorite that I want to talk to you guys about today is The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. And this is a standalone fantasy. It's a dual point of view story that follows a mother and her son on a remote place called the Sword of Kaigen. And this remote island nation has a very secretive government, and they're also about to be under attack. So the mother point of view here, Misaki, she didn't always grow up in a repressed environment, and she's kind of having this internal struggle on coping with everything happening in her life. And her son, Mamoru, is starting to be at the age where he's sort of questioning all of his surroundings, especially because he has a new friend at school that just moved to the island who's used to the outside world. So life as they know it is turned upside down as their home is attacked, and they do whatever they can to defend it using their elemental magic. I read this back in December of 2020, and I picked it up because it was very hyped at the time. Almost everyone in the reading community who had read it that I knew had given it a 4 or 5 stars, and so I was just very curious to get to this one and check it out. In particular, I remember hearing a lot about it on the Shelf Space Discord back when that was very active. The reason I loved this one so much is that it just took me on an emotional journey. This had me ugly crying at times. It had me cheering at times. It had one of the most moving character arcs I had ever read. It had a chapter that was so cathartic that I was crying because it was so cathartic. I really enjoyed the pacing in this, and I also thought that the battle and action scenes were very well written. Overall, I just think this is an amazing book, and if you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend checking it out. I think that it's great for almost everyone who reads fantasy as long as they can handle some dark content, because it's more medium paced and it has a great balance between plot work and character work. I will say though that the beginning of this one is a little bit slow, so if you're not loving it right off the bat, just keep going with it and give it a proper chance. So the next favorite that I want to talk to you guys about today is A Game of Thrones, or really the whole Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin. And this is a really epic political fantasy series with some dark moments, with several POVs, several moving plot lines. And this follows families going to war over power and control for pieces of the kingdom, all while everyone is ignoring the real threat to them in the north. So I read this in December of 2021, and I read it because my husband Jake, who at the time we were just friends, I don't even think we were dating yet, really loved it, and we had planned to do a TBR swap for February where we just picked some of our favorite books for the other one to read, and he had a long list for me, so I decided to get a bit of an early start on it. So the main reason I loved this is because it was my first real experience with a fantasy epic where I had a lot of context for the story up front since I had seen all of the show. It was really fun for me getting to explore a story that I already loved in a lot more depth while not having to use too much brain power or spending too much time having to figure things out. I also especially enjoyed reading about some of the character emotions and reactions that the TV show doesn't really show the full scope of. I enjoyed it because it was high stakes, tense, dark, and because I was just invested. Like, everything pretty much drew a solid or strong reaction out of me as I was reading. The next favorite that I want to talk to you guys about is Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. And this is a story that follows Claire, who's from the 1940s, and one day she's on vacation and she stumbles across a Celtic ritual, and she's pulled back in time to the Scottish Highlands in the 1700s. Being from the future and being married to a historian in the future, she obviously knows a lot about the historical events of the time, and her decisions in this past timeline are often based on what she knows is going to happen. And obviously this story follows her trying to figure out a way to get home, trying to navigate her way in this past timeline, and it's just really interesting. So I read this back in September of 2018, and I read it because I was doing the Pop Sugar Challenge that year, and I needed it to fill a very specific prompt. I have no idea what the prompt was anymore, but I do remember some people in a Goodreads group for the challenge recommending this for that prompt. And the reason I love this so much is that the main character, Claire, is a very strong-willed and independent thinker, but because of her circumstances, her personality often clashes with her surroundings and the societal expectations put on her. And she obviously has some knowledge about what's going to be happening in the near future based on major historical events. So it's really amusing to watch her make all of these decisions based on her knowledge and have them end up being like missteps or turn into some shenanigans that she wasn't expecting. I also just enjoyed that she just felt very out of place in her scenario, and so it kind of is relatable to anyone reading who just feels that way in a certain situation or certain circumstance in their life. I know a lot of people hesitate to pick this up because it's more thought of as romance, but I would say to those people that, like, yes, there is romance, but it doesn't really take over the central plot, at least not of the first couple books. So I would recommend dipping your toes in and giving it a try. I think the TV show, if you've seen that, plays up the romance a lot more than the books do, if I can remember correctly. The next favorite I want to talk to you guys about is The Final Empire, or Mistborn, by Brandon Sanderson. And this is a heist story set in a dystopian society where the Dark Lord has already won and is in power. Mainly, we follow a couple characters involved in this heist as they try and orchestrate their piece of the larger plan. And we get to learn a lot about their backstories and their experiences in this society. We also get to explore the magic of allomancy with one of these characters alongside them as they learn it. And we just get to go for the ride while they infiltrate the aristocracy. I read this for the first time in November of 2020, and then I reread it in March 2023 so I could finally move on with the sequels and finish out the series. And this was really recommended by pretty much everyone I knew in the booktube community at the time. Everyone said it was a really great place to start with adult fantasy, and I was pretty new to adult fantasy at the time. I think I first started reading it in 2020, with the exception of maybe a handful of them. So why did I love this one so much? Well, it was one of my first experiences with a very hard and detailed magic system, and I really loved reading all the explanations about how things worked and just taking my time trying to put theories and guesses together as to how the magic system would affect the plot moving forward. Also, I just really enjoyed the pacing, the foreshadowing, and the characters. So all in all, this was a great time. On to maybe more of a surprising pick for my next favorite. I want to talk to you guys about The Way of Shadows by Brent Weeks, and this is the first book in the Night Angel trilogy. So this follows a kid on the streets who decides to take his destiny in his own hands and decides he wants to apprentice under a master assassin so that he can get out of his current circumstances. This book follows a lot of his training and his early assignments where things slowly start to get more and more complicated as he's pulled into more intricate politics within the city and schemes. And he also starts to overhear rumors about some rare magical artifacts called Kokari. I read this in June of 2021 because I was trying to explore more dark fantasy. I had been really enjoying all the dark fantasy I was picking up, and this came highly recommended from people on Slowly Read's Discord. So why did I love this so much? I loved it because the stakes were just very high in the story, and because the main character had very strong reactions to everything happening around him and happening to him. I also just really enjoyed how intricate the plot of this book became. I think it's one of the most complicated plots I've ever read, which is pretty impressive considering this was Weeks' debut. And I also really loved the foreshadowing in this one. I thought it was really subtly done, so all the reveals still really surprised me, but I was, in hindsight, realizing, oh, this foreshadowing was there. All in all, if you enjoy darker fantasy and you haven't given this a go, I would highly recommend it. I will caveat, just don't go into this expecting quite the magic system that he's written in Lightbringer, because this one just isn't as detailed. This one just focuses on other elements of the story more. So the next favorite I want to talk to you guys about is actually two favorites, but they're in the same series, and that is The Dragon Republic and The Burning God by R.F. Kuang, books 2 and 3 in the Poppy War series. And this series follows Rin, a young girl who goes through a military academy right before a massive war breaks out in her country. In the series, we get to see her progress through the academy, and we get to see her experience in the military where she becomes more of a central or important figure in the war due to her magical abilities. She eventually gets to the point where she's making decisions for a large amount of people, and her decision-making skills are not the best, so it creates a lot of chaos. And in this series, she really has to own up to a lot of the things she's decided, and come to terms with the consequences of those things while figuring out how to continue garnering support and how to move past them. She also has to spend a lot of time figuring out how to make her magic work to her benefit and not her detriment. So I read these in November and December of 2020, and the main reason I did is because there was a buddy read happening of the series over on the Shelf Space Discord back when it was very active. And mainly these were recommended by Jessie, the bookish mom. So thank you very much to her for recommending them to me and for buddy reading them with me. And I loved these so much because they were one of my first experiences with a darker fantasy, and they were just less predictable for me because of that. They didn't use the typical tropes that I had seen or that I assumed would be there. This was also one of the first fantasy series I read where the magic had more of a steep cost and where it was also a lot less predictable. And I also just appreciated that this story went to places that no other story I had consumed ever did. So it just felt fresh and new as I was reading, and I was hooked. I will say that this series is not for everyone. Rin is a very polarizing main character, and she's a frustrating character to read about because of the decisions she makes at times. Like, oh my goodness. But if you can either see past that, or if you just enjoy reading about a character who is not doing so well and you want an experience that's more dark, then I would highly recommend this trilogy. The next favorite I have to talk to you guys about is actually 3 books in the same series, and it is books 10, 11, and 12 in the Dresden Files. So Small Favor, Turncoat, and Changes. And this is an urban fantasy series that follows Harry Dresden, a wizard for hire in Chicago. This series starts out as more of like an individual mystery of the week kind of in the first installments. But after a while, the books start building on themselves with ramifications of earlier events and with recurring characters. You also get new connections to past cases that are coming to light, and you slowly get to unpack and discover more and more about the magical community that exists in this world. So I actually binged all 3 of these installments of the series in November of 2021, and I was doing a read-along of the series with a few friends, and my library was just giving me the audiobooks one after the other, and I was loving it, so I just kept powering through. And I definitely credit a few people over on Alex Nieves' Discord for getting me very interested and intrigued by this series. I definitely remember Jake Bishop talking about it an awful lot. And why did I love these books so much? Well, it's pretty simple. Dresden is just one of those characters that's kind of like a sarcastic smartass, but that who you love anyways because he has some endearing qualities like his unerring loyalty and his refusal to give up even when hope is very slim. But these particular books in the series introduce some new plot arcs that I really enjoyed. Also, this is the point in the series where I feel like Jim Butcher really masters action scenes and tension. The stakes in these ones feel very high. The villains in here feel like they've been brought to the next level. And I also thought that the foreshadowing in these installments was fantastic as well. I'm definitely very eager for the next books to come out in this series and continue reading because I am caught up with it. The next favorites I want to bring up are First Rider's Call and High King's Tomb by Kristen Britton, and these are books 2 and 3 in the Green Rider series. So the Green Rider series follows Kerrigan, who's one day walking home from university, and she runs into this messenger who's been pierced by an arrow. And on his deathbed, this messenger begs her to deliver a very important message to the king. There's a lot more to the series from there, but that's sort of the catalyst that sets everything off. So I read book 2, First Rider's Call, in September of 2022, and I read book 3, High King's Tomb, in January of 2023. And since then, I have definitely been meaning to continue with the series, but I've been majorly slacking. So I need to get on picking up Black Veil and continuing ASAP. But I initially picked up this series because there was going to be a read-along happening of it, hosted by Josephina, and she definitely recommended the series, and I had enjoyed some of the other books she really liked, so I was eager to check out more of her fantasy favorites, and I was not disappointed. So the reason I loved these 2 in the series so much is that book 2 really kind of improved on all the complaints and criticisms I had about book 1, which was really satisfying. I was also just really engaged by the plot of both of these, and I also enjoyed the character growth present in both of these. In book 3 in particular, it's pretty amusing because our main character, Kerrigan, has a situation that sort of comes full circle on her. In book 1, she has some personality traits that are maybe a little bit annoying. And then in book 3, she's mentoring a new character who has some of those similar traits that she's already grown out of. And then she has this realization of like, oh, this was me. And it's just amusing to see her grapple with that. Definitely though, in book 3, the stakes feel higher than in the previous installments in the series. And I don't know if that's just because I was more attached to the characters by then or whether it was something else. But anyway, I've really been enjoying the series and I would definitely recommend trying it if you're up for it and you're okay with more straightforward prose. I think the tone of this series is a bit interesting too. I think because it's older, it has some more classic fantasy elements, but then they're interspersed with like dark moments that you don't necessarily see coming because dark fantasy wasn't really as popular back then. I don't think I would go so far as to class these as dark fantasy, but I do find it interesting that the author was weaving in some darker moments. Another favorite I want to talk to you guys about is one you probably all know about by now, and that is The Lies of Locke Lamora, the First Gentleman Bastards book by Scott Lynch. And this follows our main character, Locke Lamora, who is a street orphan becoming a thief. He's sort of taken in by this con artist and mentored alongside some other young people in similar life circumstances. And in this installment of the series, they're working towards orchestrating a pretty impressive heist. But they're also concerned with maintaining a good relationship with some seedier characters in the city in order to survive. So I read this for the first time in March of 2021, and then I reread it in June of 2022 with the intention of continuing the series. And then I hit a massive slump and it just didn't happen. But I am excited to get back to this series and continue with it for sure. So pretty much everyone on BookTube or in the bookish community at that time recommended this one. I didn't really talk to anyone who disliked this, and I just definitely had fear of missing out, so I had to pick this one up. I don't think it was any one specific person that recommended it to me, which is everybody loved it or everyone had things to say about it. So why did I love this one? Well, the plot was quite detailed, intriguing, creative, and tense. I really enjoyed that this book kept me guessing. I also liked that the tone was somewhat dark. Can you sense a theme in this video yet? I enjoyed the characters, but I didn't just enjoy the characters for their own right. I also enjoyed the dynamic that they had with each other. I thought the dialogue in here was fantastic, and it was just a really interesting, fun read. I would definitely recommend giving this one a try. I don't think this is one that you necessarily need the sequels right away, so even though it's an ongoing series, you can still just read this first one and enjoy it for what it is. And the last fantasy books on my top 10 fantasy favorites are Prince of Thorns and King of Thorns by Mark Lawrence, and these are the first 2 books in the Broken Empire series. So this series follows a very violent young prince, Jorg Ankrath, and his group of associates, which he calls his road brothers, and they're going around this kingdom raiding and doing pretty awful things. Honestly, he doesn't have much of a moral compass, if he has one at all. But as you continue to read through the series, you start to understand all of the tragedies that Jorg went through in his childhood and why he is as twisted as he is, and you really start understanding his need for revenge. In this series, not only does he confront the perpetrators of some of his tragedies, but he also encounters some new threats along the way, and it's just very intriguing. I read both of these books in May of 2021 because I was interested in picking up more dark fantasy, of course. And I would say this series was recommended to me by Slowly Read, but it was also enjoyed by a few people that I started realizing had similar reading taste to me. So why the heck did I love these so much, you might be asking, with such an unlikable main character? Well, I really loved the storytelling style. So these books are set in multiple timelines and they're about, I think, 4 or 5 years apart, but they definitely leave you wondering about how did we get from point A to point B? I'm so curious. The pacing was really fantastic and the stories themselves just had me really intrigued throughout. I loved slowly unpacking what the heck happened to Jorg and why he is the way he is. It seemed like anytime while I was reading I really was desperate to know something, I found that out in the next chapter while still simultaneously having something else to be really curious and wonder about. So I just had a really great time reading this, and I just really enjoyed piecing things together and discovering more and more about the situations as I read. I also thought that these books had a really great balance between character work and plot, and I appreciate the way that Jorg's character was written. I love knowing where a character stands within their story and how they relate to their own world. And it was also just a really interesting combination to read about a character who's acting this awfully while still having strong emotions, thoughts, and reactions to things. I really enjoyed reading about his internal conflict and that he wasn't one-dimensional or just like, oh, I'm gonna be awful all the time. He was still very strong-willed and opinionated while internally grappling with so many things. This is definitely not one of those favorites that I think can be widely recommended, because a lot of people are going to struggle to read from the point of view of a character who is just so awful, for lack of a better word. But I definitely appreciated this story and had a great time reading it. If you do decide you want to pick these up and give them a try, definitely make sure you check content and trigger warnings, especially for the second book. There are some pretty vivid scenes in there that have stayed with me for years and that had me bawling because I just couldn't imagine how awful they were. So definitely make sure to look up those warnings if you want to before diving into this. But otherwise, if everything I've said about it sounds interesting to you, definitely give it a go. So now that I've talked to you guys about some of my all-time favorite fantasy, let's talk about some of my favorite sci-fi. And if you know me, there's going to be absolutely zero doubt as to what this first sci-fi is. It's Golden Sun by Pierce Brown, or really the Red Rising series as a whole, but Golden Sun is my favorite of the series, so that's what I'm holding up. In this series, we follow the main character Darrow, who is part of the Red Caste, the lowest caste of society, and they're charged with living underground and mining to help terraform Mars. But one day, Darrow, through some circumstances, realizes that Mars has already been terraformed and that essentially his caste has been kept in slavery this whole time for the betterment of the upper class. And this realization spurs him into action and has him sacrificing everything to try and infiltrate the gold caste. But he has a long way to go in order to prove himself worthy of being an important gold and in earning notoriety. So I read this one for the first time in November of 2020, and then I reread it again in March of 2023. And I initially picked this series up just because I had fear of missing out. I had been pretty active over on Alex Nieves' Discord server at the time, and loads of people there were reading and loving the series at the time, including Alex himself. And a few of them suggested to me that I would probably really love this based on my reading taste. Y'all were right. So why did I love this series so much? Well, the plotting, the pacing, the foreshadowing, the villains and antagonists, and the reveals were just all top notch. This is one of those series that just kept me up late reading. I was so invested and I needed to know what happened. Also, it has one of my favorite ever side characters in a series, Severo. If you know, you know. And it's also narrated by one of my all-time favorite audiobook narrators, Tim Gerard Reynolds. So really, there was no losing out with this one. It definitely includes some of my favorite tropes in books as well, like rebellion and revenge. If you haven't tried this series yet, what the heck are you doing? You need to try it. It's going to be finished very soon. The last book comes out early next year. There's no better time than now to jump into it and love it. The next sci-fi favorite I'm going to talk to you guys about is Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. And in this book, it's 2024 and reality pretty much sucks. So it's very popular to escape into this virtual reality world called the Oasis. And the creator of this virtual world left a bunch of clues and Easter eggs and puzzles within this world for people to find. And he promised a pretty darn impressive prize to the first person who can solve all of these. This story follows our main character, Wade, who eventually stumbles upon the first piece of this big puzzle, sparking a pretty tense race featuring some pretty intimidating competition. So I read this back in July of 2021, and I picked it up because I had been doing the Pop Sugar Reading Challenge that year, and one of the prompts was to read a cyberpunk book, and I was pretty lost as to what to pick up because I was pretty new to it at that point, but several people in the Goodreads group for the challenge mentioned that this could fit the prompt, and it sounded intriguing to me as somebody who used to game. So I went ahead and picked it up, and I'm so glad I did because I loved it. This was really just the right kind of nerdy for me at the right time. And this was really my first foray into lit RPG books. I didn't really know that they existed before this. And even though this story is more like what I call lit RPG light, like it doesn't really go into character stats and all that jazz like a normal lit RPG would, I still had a really great time reading about this character who was really invested in his own gaming experience. And then the contest aspect of this story really had the tension and pacing ramped up. So I just really had a great time reading it. This was also just one of the first audiobooks I ever read. And if you don't know, this is narrated by Will Wheaton and he does a fantastic job with it. So I just had a good time with that aspect of the experience as well. If this book sounds intriguing to you, go pick it up. Read it. It's fantastic. Just ignore Ready Player 2, pretend it doesn't exist because it's not so fantastic. The next next sci-fi fave I'm going to talk to you guys about is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. And this follows Ryland, who is a sole survivor on a spaceship on a last chance mission to save the Earth. But the clincher is he wakes up with amnesia and doesn't remember that, or even who he is. So this book follows him as he slowly starts to piece together all of that information, and as he realizes he has a pretty important scientific mystery to solve. Let's just say he encounters some interesting scenarios and challenges on his journey. So I read this back in August of 2022, and I picked it up because I had really enjoyed Artemis and the Martian, which I know is a hot take because a lot of people don't like Artemis that much. But for me, I enjoyed that it was more plot heavy than The Martian and less character focused. But anyways, pretty much all of my corner of BookTube and the community I was part of was raving about this at the time. And I definitely needed to know what all the fuss was about, especially given that I'd already enjoyed his previous books. This held my attention well and kept me intrigued throughout. I really enjoyed the use of the amnesia trope in here because he recovered his memories little bits at a time, and so it was interesting to get the next tidbit and start to piece things together alongside him. I really enjoyed his thoughts and reactions to things in the story as he's realizing them too, and I also appreciated that the more science-y type content in here felt a lot more interesting and accessible than in Weir's other books. Lastly, there is a spoilery aspect to the story that is part of the reason I loved it, but I'm not going to be the one to tell you about it if you don't know. If you do know, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And all I'm going to say is if you do decide to pick this up and read it, definitely get the audiobook. You will not regret it. There is an element in this story that just translates better to audio than it does on the page. So this next one, you've heard me mention this favorite in a couple other recent videos, but maybe not on my channel. And it is Ogres by Adrian Tchaikovsky. So this is a short novella, and I actually don't really want to tell you too much about what it's about because the joy of reading this is slowly figuring out and piecing together what's happening. All I'm going to tell you is that it starts out with our main character, and the landlord of his family is coming to town, and it's not a great situation. So I read this in April of 2023, and I picked it up because I was curious to dip my toes into more Tchaikovsky. I think the only Tchaikovsky I had read before this was Elder Race, and I liked that one, but I didn't love it. This one I loved. It also just worked out very nicely because my library had the ebook very accessible, and it was perfect for a readathon that I was doing at the time. I would say the main reason I decided to go ahead and pick this Tchaikovsky up over any other was because I had heard Theo from Rekindled Reader talk about his experience reading it. He really enjoyed it, and I can't even remember exactly what he said about it that had me so intrigued, but whatever it was, I was curious and I needed to know. So the main reason I loved this is that it was thought-provoking and poignant, but it also kept me guessing and entertained. Every time in this book that I thought I had things figured out, oh boy, another piece of the puzzle would click and I would have to reevaluate what I was thinking. I just really enjoyed the reading experience of this one and would definitely recommend you give it a go if you haven't yet. And the last sci-fi fave I'm going to tell you guys about today is How to Defeat a Demon King in 10 Easy Steps by Andrew Rowe. And this is a short lit RPG story that follows our main character Yui. So essentially this world has a cycle of a demon king continuously rising and conquering a bunch of stuff, and then after 100 years a hero is reborn, goes through a bunch of trials, and then goes to defeat him. But in this cycle it's only been 23 years and this demon king has already conquered more than half the world. So our main character Yui decides, I can't afford to wait another 70 years for this next hero. So she concocts a very ambitious 10-step plan on how she is going to defeat the Demon King. So I only read this a few months ago in April of 2024, and I read it because it was a perfect fit for the Battle of the Bands readathon that we were doing at the time. I wanted something short that I had access to in audio, and Jake had it on his Audible all ready to go. And I also was just really curious to check out more lit RPG because it had been a hot minute since I had read any of it. And I do tend to enjoy it when I do read it. And I mainly loved this one just because it had a fun, enjoyable story that had me really nostalgic for some of my gaming days. And I also really appreciated that some aspects of this story were inspired by one of my all-time favorite game series, Zelda. So those were my all-time favorite sci-fi fantasy books so far. What did you guys think of my picks? Do we have any favorites in common? Let me know all of that in the comments down below. Also, do you have any recommendations for me based on my favorites? I hope I have convinced some of you to pick up some of these, and I hope that you enjoy them if you do. Thank you guys so much for watching, and have a great day. Bye!